Grace and peace be unto you, sisters and brothers, on this Lord's Wednesday. It's November 10, right? Amen. November 10. Just testing you to see if you're keeping up with the dates. Glad to see you all in the sanctuary. Welcome to those who are joining us virtually for today's lesson. And we want to continue from last week our theme, Worshipful Rhythms, from last Wednesday. There's a part of the lesson that I did not get to really go into that I want to take up today, and want to welcome people into the live stream so that we can talk about this. We can talk about grief. That is a part, a continuation of last week's session, a continuation of the worship experience on Sunday, and it's a concern that's in the hearts of people that who, preparing for this holiday season, really need the care, the love, the support of their families of faith in order to be sustained during the holiday season. So let's ask God to bless us together as we go to the book. Eternal God, the Sovereign, grant us grace that in this hour we might learn of Thee. We might bring before Thee the concerns of our lives, those things that touch us tenderly, that bring us pain, that bring us anguish, and the things for which we need Your healing. Bless us in this hour for illumination, in the name of the one whom we have met on our journey, Jesus the Christ. And all the people of God say together, amen. Amen. So I want to pick up where I ended last week when I made the statement that in the liturgical calendar, All Saints, the occasion we observed and commemorated this past Sunday, is not a perpetual observance in the calendar, because grief and mourning are not to be permanent seasons in our lives. As the seasons change, so does our emotional landscape and the things to which we are committed and invested. And that natural rhythm is also reflected in our worship life. But in Genesis 35, at the death of Rachel, there is a record of Jacob's response that I think is important for reflection, particularly as I have heard this passage used as a way of encouraging, prompting people to move on from grief. I want us to really talk about that a little bit today. And for people who are in the stream, for them to share their thoughts and their ideas about it. But if we go to Genesis chapter 35, verse 16, we have an experience of death and grief that ought to be considered within this conversation. Text reads, then they journeyed from Bethel, and when there was but a little distance to go to Ephrath, Rachel labored in childbirth, and she had hard labor. Now it came to pass, when she was in hard labor, that the midwife said to her, "Do not fear. You will have this son also." And so it was, as her soul was departing before she died, that she called his name Ben-Oni or Ben-Oni, depending on whether you want to pronounce a hard, long I or short. But his father called him Benjamin. Ben-Oni or Ben-Oni is son of my suffering, while Benjamin is son of my right hand. Verse 19, so Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. And Jacob set a pillar on her grave, which is the pillar of Rachel's grave to this day. Then Israel journeyed and pitched his tent beyond the tower of Eder. Right. So in this passage we have the death of Rachel, who is Jacob's beloved. Right? And she's not his only wife, but she is the one he loved. And she is about to bring forth the second son, because you remember the issue that arose with Rachel and Leah and the others, in the sense that she could not have children, and how that really had an injurious effect on her own self-image, worth, etc. God opens her womb and gives her 2 sons, and there is favoritism shown, right? Come on, talk to me. Yeah, there's favoritism shown. Now, that's a lesson perhaps for another day, right? To really talk about some of the dysfunctional themes in the lives of the patriarchs, right? It's an important lesson to take up, to see how some of those dysfunctions were recycled from one generation to the next, right? Which gives you the sense that whenever families fail to settle matters, it resurfaces in successive generations, right? The things you don't talk about are not dead. They just lie dormant, waiting, yes, to be revived. So now Rachel is in childbirth and she dies as a result of childbirth. Okay? As the life is waning from her, she is naming the son for the suffering, while Jacob renames him for a promise and a purpose. Verse 19 says, she dies, is buried on their way to Bethlehem. Jacob sets a pillar on her grave. It marks where she's resting. And then verse 21 says, he journeys toward or beyond the Tower of Eder. Okay. Now, when this text is used occasionally at funerals, it's used with verse 21 as the real emphatic point. Then Israel journeyed on. The lesson and the message that comes to the family is journey on. Okay. Now, that message in and of itself is not a bad message. Okay. I want you to know, it's not a bad message. But it is an incomplete message if you do not help people with the journeying on. Do you hear what I'm saying? Right? So when the family is seated at the service and someone is giving words of comfort, if you simply say journey on, right? It can come across as insensitive, even if it is not intended to be, especially if the support and the resources for journeying on are not provided for people to take up that invitation. Yeah. So it's spring 2009. Okay. And I'm in retreat with colleagues in a pastoral residency program. And the heart of the residency program is theological reflection on the work that we were engaging as ministers in a clinical setting. And during the course of the retreat, as we're sharing intimately about experiences of our lives that pose difficulties for us, emotional difficulties. And I know what happens when people start talking about emotional difficulties. Certain walls of defenses go up. Because when you deal openly with emotional difficulties, you run the risk of stepping on people's terrain of vulnerability. And unlike social media culture, where people post what they're eating, what they're wearing, just all the stuff. We still have not gotten to the place where we are all comfortable talking about those places that are still tender for us. Am I right? Am I right? Come on. See, y'all don't even want to commit to say I'm right because those walls are already gone up. Right? It happens because you don't share everything publicly. Not the things that really touch you. Yeah. Not those things that trigger you. You keep them preserved. You keep them sealed. And the people to whom you make them known are people you trust. You trust with that vulnerability because your experience with them is that they can handle it. They can keep your confidence, right? That doesn't often happen in the context of just a public exchange. And something happened in that retreat that touched one of my lines of vulnerability, and I recoiled. And here's why I recoiled. Because in the words of a common parlance, the person didn't know me like that. Right? Come on. We're family. Come on, let's talk. Right? See, because you can hear the same thing from 10 people, but I guarantee you hearing it from the right person will make all the difference. Do you see right? If someone who doesn't know you says something about you, you don't lose any sleep about that. Why? They don't know you. Huh? But let it be, come on, someone who knows the whole story. It'll touch you differently. So what was said to me as we were sharing in the intimacy of the conversation, I was sharing with my colleagues my lingering grief about my brother's murder that had taken place 2 years prior. And one of my colleagues responded, "When are you going to let that go?" What you talking about, Willis? Right? Like, wait, what? Right? You can imagine the visceral response I had to a question like that. Right? Right. Now, let me say one thing parenthetically here. Whenever someone honors you by sharing something deep about themselves, please do right by the honor they are bestowing upon you. All right? Can I press that just a little bit more? Because the person is inviting you to stand on what is their tender and holy ground. And what they do not need from you or me when they invite us to stand on their tender and holy ground is a heap of our opinions. Yeah. They need someone who is sensitive enough to hear them with the third ear and respond to them at the level in which they're sharing. Right? So then, Deacon Ware comes and shares with me, Pastor, this is my concern. I don't take over Deacon Ware's conversation with, well, that reminds me of what happened to me. And then I go off on a tangent with all that happened to me, and I leave Deacon Ware, I leave him no better than he was when he came and shared with me. This is his concern. So I co-opted his conversation. And then he's left. He's left actually worse off because he's now exposed to me what's paining him, what's grieving him. And all I did is leave him further exposed. You hear me? Y'all hearing me? Right? So, she says, when are you gonna when are you gonna let it go? Now, see, responding to people in grief is not about you making your point. No matter how right or profound you and I think we are, it's actually about responding to a need. Do you hear me? And sometimes, even the good you have to offer may be ill-timed. Right? You're going quiet on me. Come on. Let me know you're at least tracking with me, right? You're tracking with me? Right? And you have to have that sensitivity and that discernment. Certainly not to dismiss what someone has to say. Even if it sounds trite and trivial to you, if they brought it, take it seriously. Don't say, oh, that ain't nothing to worry about. No. If they brought, because that's a horrible feeling for someone to muster the courage to share something with you, and all you end up doing is saying to them, it really doesn't mean a whole lot. So, let me tell you why I was offended by it. And I've got some years from it, right, that I processed it. One, she didn't have that emotional credibility with me to even go there. You see, you can't give advice to people with whom you are not in relationship. Do you hear me? Perhaps this is the challenge in the relationships, and I'm taking these things, but because I'm trying to do some pastoral instruction. See, because this ain't any of you all in here. It ain't none of y'all, so don't think I'm talking about y'all. But you know what happens when you get a certain age and you see younger people and you start saying, well, we never did this when we were young. Right? You know, this generation, oh, y'all never, right? That happens. I'm not talking about any of y'all in here or anybody on the cyber link either. I'm just talking. I'm talking about people I heard about, right? But what happens is they present themselves and someone older than they makes a remark to them that kind of rubs them the wrong way. And it's not that the remark cannot be of benefit to them. It's the fact that the person from whose lips the remark was spoken has never ever said good morning to them. Huh? It reminds me of a situation. I was in Milwaukee, and I was going to a funeral to support a member family at a funeral at another congregation, and it was cold, so I had my fedora. I was wearing my fedora, and I stepped inside the church, and there was still the wind coming through those doors. When I stepped inside the church on the landing, there were steps going up, and I had not yet ascended the steps to get to the main landing of the narthex to go into the sanctuary. And because it was still cold, my hat was still on my head. And immediately, an usher ran to me. Take your hat off your head. You know better than that. Now, she caught me on an unguarded moment. It was already snowy outside and cold. I couldn't find a parking spot. I got to circle the block a couple of times. I got to walk to get in the church, to be present with a family. And all I do is walk in the door, and immediately I want to tell you like a senior preacher told me years ago. He's now of blessed memory. He says, it's not that I can't cuss because I still remember the words. It's just that I choose not to. And I thought, you could have let me get into place and, you see what I'm saying? Adjust. But she had no relationship with me. Right? So there are some things that we can only say to people when we have the relationship. Do you hear me? with them. Right? So the sister on the retreat had no relationship with me like that to say that. And then secondly, she had not walked in my experience. She did not know the particulars of my grief. My brother was found days after he had been murdered. So I never even saw my brother's remains. Do you get what I'm saying? There are things that complicate people's grief. If he had died a death, other than the way he died, and there were remains that could be viewed, that could have been different. Right? The rituals of grief for us, help us come to terms with the finality of death in terms of this side. And then no one caught for the murder. And I was doing my part by emailing the chief of police of the island to try to find out what is the status of the case and all of this, right? So she never knew all that kept me where I was. Because it's really not about making you comfortable. It's really about dealing and ministering to the person who carries the heaviness, the weight of that responsibility. And this is why, beloved, I'm going to tell you something. This is why, I want to be very clear about this. As a pastor, I do not masquerade as a therapist. I don't masquerade as a therapist. I don't pretend to be a counselor, a licensed professional counselor. I don't pretend to be that. I do not have those skills. What I do when I realize that the need far exceeds my ability as a pastoral caregiver is to support the member, but also make the referral to someone who I know is trained and skilled and credentialed to do that. That's important. Why it's important is because at the end of the day, I do not live in the world of your grief. And I cannot build an edifice for you to live in that won't aid you in your grief. Hear what I'm saying. And well-intentioned Christians do that all the time. You build a narrow house for people to live in, and then you go about your business and leave them in a confining space. Be okay telling people, I don't know. Be okay telling people that's beyond my skill set. Be okay telling people, let me help you get the help you really need. And it doesn't mean that you are any less faithful. It doesn't mean that you don't have trust in God. It means you care enough for the other person's soul so as to not do any damage to them. Hear me, hear me, hear me. That's what a pastor does. We care for the souls of people. We don't just push one-fits-all advice. We care for the souls of people. And we realize that for some people, their concerns are so complex that they need more than what we can handle. Yeah. Are y'all here? Y'all tracking with me? Because when she said it, I realized, yeah, she won't be a person I go to again. And you don't want that to be made about you. You hear me? Right? You want to be sensitive, open. C.S. Lewis writes a book on grief observed. And excerpts of that text are in this little small book, C.S. Lewis on Grief. There are excerpts from Mere Christianity and excerpts from on Grief Observed that are contained in this text. But there's a reflection in here that I want to read for us to have an appreciation for it. And it's simply because there were a lot of great compliments and comments made from Sunday service about the ministry of care that was offered, particularly to the families who've experienced loss. And beloved, I want us to always be sensitive to it, because grief is not done because the funeral is over. And it's not just done because a year is past. Because the truth is, sometimes it does take a lifetime. And that doesn't mean that your life is no longer productive. It means you find ways to cope with the loss. Right? Right? Yeah. And there are people who are challenged because they think to try and stay productive means forgetting the person who has died. Right? Sometimes we're so narrow in the ways that we respond to people that we give them an either or choice, but it's not really an either or choice. Right? So let me read what C.S. Lewis writes when he loses his wife under the title When the House is Empty. No one ever told me that grief felt so like fear. I'm not afraid, but the sensation is like being afraid. The same fluttering in the stomach, the same restlessness, the yawning. I keep on swallowing. At other times, it feels like being mildly drunk or concussed. There is a sort of invisible blanket between the world and me. I find it hard to take in what anyone says, or perhaps hard, listen, to want to take it in. It is so uninteresting. Yet I want the others to be about me. I dread the moments when the house is empty. If only they would talk to one another and not to me. There are moments, most unexpectedly, when something inside me tries to assure me that I don't really mind so much, not so very much after all. Love is not the whole of man's life. I was happy before I ever met H. I've plenty of what are called resources. One is ashamed to listen to this voice, but it seems for a little to be making out a good case. Then comes a sudden jab of a red-hot memory, and all this common sense vanishes like an ant in the mouth of a furnace. And no one ever told me about the laziness of grief. Not only writing, but even reading a letter is too much. Even shaving. I mean, what does it matter now whether my cheek is rough or smooth? They say an unhappy man wants distraction, something to take him out of himself, only as a dog-tired man wants an extra blanket on a cold night. He'd rather lie there shivering than get up and find one. All right, so he's telling you things that we don't always say in public, because the shallowness of culture teaches us that any time when you are asked how you doing, the only acceptable response is, I'm okay. I'm fine. I'm good. When the truth is, we're not. And if you frequent places where you always have to be good, you need a new place to frequent. If you only deal with people who can only deal with you if and when you're good, write a new advertisement for some new friends. Because life is about those seasons. And sometimes you have to deal and live through the madness of midnight misery. Yeah. Right. So then Jacob, now can I say something to you? Because you all are mature enough to handle it. Can I say something to you and you all really hear what I'm saying? Right? So I know y'all can handle this. Sometimes we press the biblical text to do something it wasn't intended to do. Am I okay? Am I okay? All right. Y'all just give me a nod, I don't want, right? I don't want to get called up before no theological tribunal now, Right? So sometimes you press a text to do what it was not intended to do. Because what we get here is a historical accounting of what happened when Rachel died. I wish that the historiographer had told us how Jacob felt. But we don't get that. Because this was the one he loved. Right? Is it? Huh? Rachel was the one. He sure enough loved Rachel. Because even after working the time that he had agreed to work for her and then was duped, he loved her enough to say, I'll keep working for her. Huh? Now, teasing out all of the rivalry between the women in the situation, that's another lesson. That's another lesson. Right? That's another lesson. But he loved Rachel. And now Rachel is dead. And you can't tell me that he moved on so antiseptically like the passage presents it. Huh? Am I making sense? You can't convince me that all you do is just bury someone, put a marker there, and keep it moving without feeling anything. Nah. Not the one he loved. So then, the text does not give us all. And because we do not have all, we cannot take this text and just simply say to people, move on. Huh? Right? Because, 50 years ago, as therapists and psychologists have been thinking about grief, they came up with what they call 5 stages of grief. And if you think in linear fashion, it really doesn't work like that. That you go from, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. Right? These are experiences of grief. Because in the normal course of experiencing grief, you could double back to any one of these phases throughout your experience, right? There's denial and isolation. That's when the news breaks and you say, no. No, that's not true. No. It happened to me September 17th when I was preaching in Raleigh, North Carolina in revival, and the revival was over. I was getting ready to come back, and I looked at my phone. I saw some messages, missed calls from a colleague of mine back home, a good brother, and I said, well, he's calling me rather early. And then, like anyone in my generation, you go to social media. You want to know what happened overnight, right? What done happened in the world overnight? And then I see this message that one of our good leaders, Tim Stewart, had died. Wait, what? We'd been on a call with him that week, in a session, and unexpectedly, denial. And for that day, I said, no, this didn't happen. No. Denial. Isolation, where you want to be alone. Because if you are alone, you could reinforce your denial. You don't have to accept it. Denial. Isolation. Right. Then there's anger. You're mad. And now this is important because church folks think you don't ever get angry with God. That's not true. Yeah, you do. Yeah. I remember I was, the days after the death in 2007, there was a song that I loved. It was from Kurt Carr. He had a new album, a new CD that came out not long there, maybe a year before. God blocked it. He wouldn't let it be so. And I remembered how that song used to bless me before March 24, 2007. And how I had a visceral response to it on the other side of the death. And I said, turn that off. He didn't block it for my brother. I remember that. I remembered the months and the weeks after, and I don't know if I shared it with you before, but the truth is, I kind of stopped going to church for a little minute. Now, I was in divinity school, y'all. I was preparing, right? It's like, somebody who's studying to be a physician saying, I'm not going to go to the hospital for a while. Right? Because that can happen. Right? I struggled. And I would spend my Sunday mornings watching the late Tim Russert meet the press. Right? Meet the press. Until one, listen. I'm going right back to the point I made earlier, relationship. Until one Sunday morning, while sitting in the apartment in Louisville, Keisha sat right next to me and asked, babe, why aren't you going to church anymore? What's going on with you and God? Yeah. Now, had it been someone else, it would have been a different story. But when people know you and they ask you those deep, penetrating questions, you know you can't hide. Huh? This is why church life is so important. Let me tell you why, right? Because in church life, we live together. And if someone is missing from their usual and customary place, the people who love them hear me, the people who love them must go and see about them. Yeah. And minister to them. So there's denial, isolation, there's anger, then there's bargaining, negotiation. Sometimes this even happens before death, where someone is gravely ill and you say to them, to God, hey, if you heal, I'll do this. Or even in that bargaining negotiation, you might say, God, if I had not done this, this person would not have died. Or in that process, you start taking on things and start thinking that God did that to get back at you. God is not that petty. God ain't petty. God ain't petty. Right? God ain't petty. Now, let me tell you why that's important, because at the funeral, and I'm at a different place at this now. I just want you to know that I'm at a different place. I can talk about it now freely because I've learned a whole lot, you know. And it's not that I don't miss my brother. I do, you know. I do. And particularly as I reached the age that he was when he died at 31, that was tender for me. And then got older, the years he never got, that, but I miss him. But I'm at a different place. But let me tell you what it ticked me off. You know, my preacher colleagues get up there pontificating. And one in particular, you know, Shakespeare says all the world's a play, all the world's a stage. We come on scene, we play our part, and then we exit. What? It's like, what? Is that all you got? Right? Is that? Because we don't often think about what we're saying when we say these things. Because I'm trying to explain to his 5-year-old son before we go to the service what we're going to. Right? And if God is that callous and indifferent, you think God goes around with God's finger on a gun trigger? Is that what God does? Right? We don't think these things through. Because we heard someone say it at someone else's service, we think it's okay to say it at the next one we show up to. And then you end up leaving people with more pain than they experienced before coming into the service. My time is up. My time is up. Let me give you this last one and then we'll go. Then there's depression and acceptance. Depression is one, acceptance is the fifth. Now, remember, I really don't see them as stages. I see them as experiences. Because you could be in and out of any one of two of them at different times and go back to them. It's not a checklist for you to say, well, I'm done with this phase, so now, give me my certificate, let me go to my third phase. Right? Because at any given moment, sometimes it can trigger you. And actually, it happened to me this year, after 14 years, I had not had a real emotional outburst about it until this past March. And I realized death robs you of so much of the future with someone. It robs you. They don't get to see you, and you don't get to see all the potential that they could really become. And that's painful, especially when someone dies young. And tragically, you grieve because you won't see all that they could have become. Yeah. All right, let me pause there. I hope this is making sense to you, and I hope it's a being of some blessing to you, because these are the things that we have to really work out as we live together, caring for each other, so that when people allow us to stand on their sacred and holy ground, we honor that invitation by taking our shoes off. So may God bless you, and God continue to keep you. May God grant you grace and grit for each day of the journey. Is my prayer through Jesus Christ the Lord. Amen.